Hi, I'm Andrew Kane, politics editor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, and with me are reporters Anna Bryson, Dave Ress, and Charlotte Renee Woods, and we're here to talk about the week that was in Virginia politics. And right now, we're supposed to be having adjournment a week from tomorrow, and we'll see if that actually comes to pass. Right now, I'm sort of reminded of the old Rick Bragg memoir that he called All Over But the Shoutin'. So we'll see if that's actually the case. Let's talk about some of the late action to dispense with some of the hot button issues. Charlotte, we've got some abortion bills that are up in committee today. What do we expect to see there?
It's happening as we're speaking, and I'm going to have to watch a recording to follow up on that, but I expect they would not get through because it's the court's subcommittee number 1. Courts of Justice is not very favorable to these types of bills. We've already seen abortion restricting bills shot down in the Senate, and now the things that have cleared the Senate that would protect access are being heard in the House where they may not fare very well. And Speaker Todd Gilbert said at the start of the session that the issue is just kind of a non-starter this year. But as I've said before, legislators wanted to show their voting bases that they tried, because sometimes it's just trying and not getting anywhere on something.
And let's give folks an example of what's up in that committee today. Senator McClellan's measure is up today, right?
Yes, so she has a proposed constitutional amendment that would protect abortion access within the state code. Charnel Herring has a version in the House, and this week Delegate Marcus Simon introduced a rule change that has to be read several times before it can be voted on that would force a vote on some of the abortion bills that the House hasn't reviewed yet, which includes Herring's similar constitutional amendment along with a Youngkin-backed 15-week ban bill.
I see. Okay. Anna, we've also seen some legislation dealing with education that's been killed off this week. It seems like both sides are sort of clearing the decks. Some of it had to do with transgender students.
Mm-hmm. The last two bills that had to do with transgender students were killed this week. There was the athlete bill, which would have effectively banned transgender athletes from both K-12 schools and the collegiate level from participating in sports on the teams that align with their gender identity. The other one, LGBT advocates called it a forced outing bill, which basically if a student told a teacher that they were identifying as transgender, the teacher would then have to notify somebody and the parents would be notified. People on the other side, of course, say, well, hey, it's our kids, we deserve to know what's going on with them.
Right. And regarding education, you also saw signs this week where a bill that seemingly had bipartisan support was defeated, had something to do with education. A sign of sort of both sides sort of hardening their positions. Tell folks what happened there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a couple like that. One actually passed unanimously through the House that would have allowed there are certain military groups of kids, very small, but that for some reason are not at this point allowed to attend governor's schools. It would have let them do that. It passed through the House 99-0 and then got shot down in subcommittee. Another one had to do with canines. It would have fixed some guidelines for school divisions to contract with non-law enforcement canine teams, and that was voted down in committee this week. But yeah, the VEA actually opposed it, the State Teachers Union, and they...
what was their rationale?
In testimony, they said that sometimes with these canine dogs, they can sniff out false positives when they're looking for guns or something. And the person talked about how it can have adverse psychological effects on the children if that happened, to which Emily Brewer, the delegate who introduced the bill, said that it's probably more disruptive to have a school shooting.
And so what we're seeing here, the big picture, of course, is that both sides are sort of digging in, and there have been allegations from Democrats and Republicans that their bills are getting defeated out of spite at this point, as both sides harden their positions. Dave, you've seen some examples of this as well.
Yeah, well, we had a couple. Emily Brewer had a bill about state contracting with, it was initially with Chinese government and Chinese party affiliate companies. Mm-hmm. It got expanded to deal with what are called foreign adversaries. It's a U.S. Department of Commerce thing. It had this funny, it was initially through the House party line. Then they did a reconsideration, went through 99 zip. So it looked like it was going to go.
Because the Democrats' amendments to broaden it to
Yep.
be not solely
Not
about
solely
the
China.
Chinese government.
And one of the things you'll hear from Democrats is that, we talk a lot about China with this bill, with the farmland bill, for instance. Another bill, actually, is both House and Senate bill, that would say we would bar Chinese government affiliates from buying farmland as just kind of politically posturing. The usual line is it's politically posturing by the governor, trying to build up a national, kind of a national profile. The thing about the China bill is that after going through the House 99 zip, it comes before a Senate Finance Committee, and there it's just defeated. Also strictly party line. The rationale was, some of it was, acquisitions, particularly of small tech companies, can be hard to track. You got a wiseacre comment from Senator Norman about how with his usual thing of how, well, I may not be a great lawyer, but with a little bit of persistence. Cree Deeds raised the point that this bill also included the governor's TikTok and WeChat ban, and he was uncomfortable with naming specific companies in the code. In any event, it died. The governor isn't happy, just as he wasn't happy with the final death of his high-profile effort to make drug dealers subject to felony homicide charges if their drugs cause an overdose.
Which that has also now triggered, it's going to feature, I think, in elections this year. There's already some digital attack heads going against Democrats for voting against that.
I think elections are really kind of hanging over a lot now. We have a number of legislators, a really large number actually in the Senate, I think close to half, who are facing primaries. So that's a June election. That's also one that has early voting, so early May. You can, of course, I think, fundraise during a special session, but you do have to concentrate a little bit on what the special session is for. And some of the people who are facing primaries are budget negotiators, so that'll be, that made a little hint from the governor at a town hall in Henrico kind of interesting, because an obnoxious reporter asked him, well, what do you think about a special session? And he sort of said, well, I'm sure they can do it, but I'm here all summer, and mentioned that last year we had a similarly large gap and it was eventually resolved. It was eventually resolved, which he didn't say, in June.
And that gets us to some of the unfinished business with about a week to go. As Dave alluded to, the biggest unfinished business is over the disparate versions of the state budget. As we've said before, there's about a $1 billion discrepancy in these two spending plans, with the House backing the governor's proposed tax cuts and the Senate basically digging in and saying, rather than doing additional tax cuts, they want to use this additional revenue for further beefing up spending on education and behavioral health and things of that nature. So, Dave, what's the sense of play here? Is this going to string out for a while, or is it going to wait until the veto session, or what's the likelihood something's going to get done in a week?
Well, there's an obvious thing to do, and we got some hints of it in the House debate over the budget, over the Senate budget in particular, and that's that Delegate Sally Hudson, for instance, made a very, very strong point.
Democrat from Charlottesville.
Democrat from Charlottesville, that the size of the corporate income tax, the amount of revenue involved with that, would be just about equal to the amount of money they would need to fully fund the state standards of quality, which of course is what the state tells local governments you got to do without necessarily paying for it all. So I think there's a fairly obvious sort of trade-off there. Okay, you give up the corporate tax, we get some more of, but not quite as much as we wanted for the K-12. I the folks I talk to say, that's pretty obvious. We're probably going to end up there, but there's going to be some hooting and hollering in the meanwhile.
So the question, as usual in a negotiation, is will the two sides be willing to take half a loaf, or will they dig in and say, I want what I want? One of the interesting aspects here is the Senate's got 9 negotiators on its team out of the 40-member Senate. Many of these are very experienced senior folks, but perhaps 5 of these folks might not be coming back, either in retirements or because some of them, like Senator Craig Deeds, who faces a primary challenge from Sally
Sally
Hudson.
Hudson.
So given the fact that some of these folks know this is their last stand, they could dig in. I mean, Senator Janet Howell, co-chair of the Senate Finance Committee, has said she doesn't think they're going to budge on the taxes. And if they don't give it all, this could go on for a while.
It could indeed. And what Charlotte had mentioned, and we all know is coming because we're gearing up for a busy summer and
election
fall,
year.
is elections. And so then you start thinking of, well, how does it play if you dig in your heels on particularly the individual income tax breaks? How does it play if you can't do a budget at all? You layer that on top of abortion, on top of guns, on top of
Opioids.
felony homicide and being kind to drug dealers, and you've got a real
And we have
potent political season.
Yeah, we also have new districts, a lot of incumbents moving into new districts or drawn into districts with their friends and coworkers. And so you've got all these hot button issues that didn't get a lot of traction this year that everyone knows pending these elections, they will next year maybe. And you've got voters learning their new districts, getting to know, do they want someone who's willing to compromise, or do they want someone who's going to stand firm on a strict line? And then, we also have to remember that we're talking about partisanship earlier. Right now, the Republicans have the House, the Senates have the Democrats have the Senate, and then, we have a Republican governor. And I think Republicans really want to flip the Senate chamber so they can have a trifecta like what Northam had during his administration. And then, Democrats want to hold the line. And Louise Lucas says, the brick wall.
And there are some elections possibly after this year that are on folks' minds, because if we end up with either a divided legislature or Democrats winning control of both houses, then a governor who seems to have ambitions beyond Virginia
He won't be
is
able
going
to
to
get as
have
much
a
done.
really tough time doing an agenda that's going to play nationally.
Yeah. So it was interesting in that respect when the governor told you I'll be around all summer. My ears sort of perked up at that because Nikki Haley has announced, DeSantis could be looking to announce, obviously former President Trump is out there. The first GOP candidate debate comes up this summer in Wisconsin, I believe. So if the governor is truly going to be around all summer, that's sort of an interesting indication. But we could be reading too much into the tea leaves. Let's quickly talk about a couple of the other unresolved issues. Dave, the Dominion regulation is yet to be resolved. In layman's terms, what's the latest on that?
Well, the bottom line is Terry Kilgore, who was carrying the House version of the Dominion bill, says they're close. The issue comes down to a part of the bill that effectively tells the State Corporation Commission, calculate Dominion's profit rate this way. That's something that really bothers people like Lee Ware, the Republican from Powhatan, who believes the commission should be determining all of this stuff itself. That's standard, old-fashioned regulatory theory from the days when we first started regulating monopolies. We have a little bit of a break that might help with Tommy Norman suggesting a sunset on that directive to the SCC, and a sunset that marries very closely to the construction of the offshore wind, which is a $9 billion project that Dominion is worried about financing. If that is something that makes it through, and you have a possibility of people saying, gee, we really want offshore wind, there's one other moving piece that might be enough to put it over, and that's language in the Dominion bill that talks about, that opens the door for keeping fossil fuel plants open, which makes the green movement really really concerned.
So again, it's going to come down to whether people are willing to take half a loaf, and whether they're willing to compromise, or whether they dig in. One other key unresolved issue is the idea of who's going to get the next crack to vote on a potential casino. As folks know, Petersburg and Richmond have been lobbying hard to give their localities the next chance. And so we saw some movement on that just yesterday with Petersburg suffering a defeat, right?
Yep. Again, in Senate Finance, the Senate version of that bill died earlier on. A House version made it through.
And this was the bill that would have given Petersburg the chance to vote on a casino.
Right. And would have forestalled any effort by Richmond to have a second referendum. Because remember, Richmond had defeated it. Richmond was one of 5 cities that the original legislation designated as these are where casinos can be. Petersburg wants in on the action. The Senate version of letting Petersburg in and holding Richmond off got defeated. The House version made it through, but it landed in front of Senate Finance, and it got defeated there.
So now the last hope for Petersburg at this point is to have something happen as part of the budget negotiations. And this gets us back to the stew or the sausage, where there are a lot of different moving parts in that. So we'll have to see whether this gets done by a week from tomorrow. I would expect that they're going to decide whether they're close enough to stick around and get it done, or they're going to give it more time, because these elections are going to be coming up soon. We have a 45-day early voting window, and so they don't want to stick around if they're not close to a deal. So,
And it's also just really important for the budget because, all these bills are, passing through chambers, but if they require funding and they don't make it through the budget, then it's like the bill never even passed.
And adding to the pressure, apparently Speaker Todd Gilbert from Shenandoah County, Republican, is saying Saturday is, as they say, sine die, which is that's the end.
So we invite you to continue to follow our coverage on richmond.com and in the Richmond Times-Dispatch.